Well, today we are going to start the week, kick off a week of exploring and discovering and researching Yanis Xenakis. So today starts that conversation. So the reason that we like to do this is so that we can get the conversation started, because a lot of things are new to us. A lot of things we have found that we want to corroborate. We want to make sure we've got our sources, that everything's accurate. And we have a feeling that you know quite a bit about these topics as well. So
we don't claim to be experts.
No, definitely not. Enthusiasts, maybe.
Just know that the perspective is that we like these things. Sometimes we actually have only heard about the person like the week that we decide to cover them. It's that new. No, most of the time we
have a peripheral
our
knowledge,
fans, maybe we've heard some of their music. Maybe we've known for a long time that, they're a buzz name of, Cosmic Tape music. But
we haven't put all the pieces together.
But we haven't quite done like the investigative dive that we do prior to at least starting one of these conversations. But just know that if you chime in with a question, or you have if you want to know more about the person, we're all in the same boat.
And anyone who knows more or has a personal story about it, that just enriches our research together as a group. So that's what we're hoping to do, is to start the conversation, and then throughout the week we can all, experience more by sharing together.
Like, we want to know that your grandfather actually got piano lessons from the person as a child, kind of stuff. Please tell us your stories.
The more personal, if you have their music, or there's a good story about how you got into their music, any peripheral knowledge you have about the topics related to the person, we're all here to be like our little research society.
Exactly.
But
we invite you.
So we will kick it off, and then throughout the week you can add to it, your questions, your information that you have, articles that you find, things like that, so that we can all get more enlightened
together.
So I'm really excited because I've been having a lot of Yanis Xenakis articles and videos coming across my plate through all of my scrolling and my rabbit holes that I go down on the internet. He keeps popping up. So I was like, you know what, this week we just have to do this, because you need to follow the cosmic signs sometimes. So we've been diving into him a bit for the past few days, and it is a fantastical world to be part of. So I'm really excited to be covering him. There's so much.
An original tape music hero for us for a long time. We've been listening to his pieces, probably for 5, 7, 10 years, I think pretty intentionally. But we haven't quite gone down the documentary route, with him. And it's been really fun to discover some of the specifics about his life.
Yeah, the full arc of his life is almost too unreal. A lot of people we've talked about, their story just seems like someone wrote it, like it can't be real. And he is probably in the top 3 of that for me.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to believe that he's done the things that he's done.
He overcame so much personally and professionally as well. And politically, of course. So I guess we'll just, we'll jump in and start sharing what we've learned and the sources that we've learned from. We like to throw the links in this conversation so that you can follow along and double check those things with us as well and get deeper in your own time about them. As always, we can't play any music on here, but feel free to, use the links that we share in the conversation to listen as we talk.
We'll link you up.
Yeah, so starting with his early life, he is Greek, but his parents were in Romania when he was born. So he was actually born in Romania.
So he's Romanian.
And he has kind of a lot of nationalities.
He's got a Greek last name.
And he speaks a lot of languages as well, but he is very, very Greek. His family is, completely Greek. But for some reason, and I'd have to look more into that, why he was born in Romania and why he was there in 1922. So again, like a lot of the people that we've been studying, born in the 20s, came of age during World War II. But what's really unique about him is, there's a lot of parallels to Stockhausen throughout his whole life story, but his mother died when he was 5, and it was very traumatic for him, and he says that he never really overcame that, because what it did to his life is, at age 5, his father moved him back to Greece, someplace he had never been. He was raised by governesses and going to boarding schools and all these things, which, to me, that sounds, kind of cool, kind of interesting. You're getting, education that might be better than what a lot of other people are getting, but you've lost your mother, so.
It just hit me that we know somebody in our immediate sphere who had that same experience as a child.
I'm not quite sure who you're talking about, but I'd love to.
My dad.
Oh, your dad. Yes, your dad's mother died when he was about 5, yes.
Yeah.
Also, still very impacted by that. So, things that happen to you.
So that kind of puts things in perspective. Like, I know that he's had a lot to overcome, so it makes, now I'm seeing Xenakis from a completely different perspective.
And then to be moved to a whole new country and all of these things that he had to deal with. But what's really the thing that I've been like, I want to read more about this, is that he actually was in college when the Nazis were occupying Greece, and he was part of the protests. He was in, the anti-fascist movement, also the pro-communist movement. So he was extremely political, but I think it had a lot to do with survival and not so much this academic political standpoint that a lot of us in the Western world might have. He was, involved in the actual violence that was going on, and, saw a lot of his friends die. And,
What was Greece's involvement with in World War II?
Well, actually, I'm sorry, the Nazis invaded, but it was actually the Italians. The Italians invaded Greece, and were attempting to take it over.
Gotcha.
As part of the expansion of the empire.
I guess I just hadn't really heard,
Yeah, you don't hear a lot about Greece's fight during World War II. And for, okay, we're studying somebody who came up during this time, but they're from Greece. So you don't think that maybe like this was going to have as much of an impact, but it was probably more so than anyone else we've talked about.
Yeah.
I know Delia Derbyshire talked about her experiences as a young child, hearing the air raid sirens and how much that infected her, and being taken away from her home and her family during the war. But he was an adult. He was in college. And so he was, fighting. He said he was always on the front lines because he was young and he was a college student. So he has, if you've ever seen a picture of him, he was actually hit by, it was actually the British who came. Actually, the Greeks drove the Italians and the Nazis out of Greece. And then the British moved in to try to reinstitute monarchy in Greece. And he fought against them as well. And it was fighting the British that he was hit with shrapnel in his face and disfigured. And apparently his friends left him for dead.
So he wasn't in the military.
No,
he was just fighting.
He was part of these extremist groups.
Street
considered
fighting?
Extremist groups.
Protesting, maybe?
Yeah, in the anti-fascist movement. So
Gotcha.
He was sort of, I guess, his own little faction of protest. There is a name, and I will look that up. Of
he was
specific,
participating
sort of militia group that he was
resistance,
part of. Yeah,
right.
Mm-hmm.
In sort of his own unofficial.
It was like a resistance army.
Gotcha.
Because
I'm just like, wait, he wasn't suited up, right?
No.
Yeah.
But yeah, his friends left him for dead because he looked so disfigured that they thought there was no way he would survive, and I guess they were trying to survive. Apparently his father found him, which I found really interesting. What was his father doing? How did he know where he was?
Yeah.
His father found him, and he actually was able to survive.
Maybe he knew that he was going to be there that day,
how
and
much?
when he
Well,
found
maybe
out
his
what
friends
was
survived
going to
and told him.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, or that makes sense. His friends probably ran to his dad.
So, I mean, already he's lost his mother, he's moved to a new country, he's fighting the Nazis, he's fighting the British, he's left for dead, he's overcoming being disfigured, and then he actually has to escape to France because of his political activities. They really cracked down once they kicked the British out. They cracked down on all the leftist, movements and communist movements in Greece. And because of him being so outspoken, apparently he wasn't as much as his friends, but anybody who was, he was sentenced to death. So he fled to France while that was being determined, and he snuck into France illegally. And he was going to go to America, but I guess once he got to France, he decided not to leave. So
makes sense.
He was never allowed to go back to Greece.
It would vibe with his architectural, artistic side.
So while all of this is going on, while he's fighting and protesting and almost dying, he also got his degree in civil engineering in Athens. How was he doing all of this? You
couldn't do online schooling then.
He was truly a mathematical genius, and he was really just a lover of music. Apparently his mom introduced him to music at a young age. Obviously, she died when he was 5. And he just was really, an avid listener of music, probably more than just your average person.
Yeah.
And then when he was in these boarding schools, he had to be in the boys' choir, so he got exposed to the classical greats, and apparently Bach had a big impression on him, which makes sense because his music is very mathematical.
Well, he could hear the patterns early on, right? He was kind of noticing that right off the bat. That was his whole entry point into being sort of obsessed with music. Yeah, he had such a mathematical mind. He could hear the math in the music, and that was the connection for him. But also he was an engineer and an architect. So all of these things connected for him, and I think it has a lot to do with his Greek heritage and his study of Greek philosophy. And a lot of these people like Plato, they were multidisciplinarians. So I think that for him, these things were not separate. He wasn't just one thing. He wasn't just into math, and so he was an engineer. He saw the way that math existed in nature and how music existed in nature and how all of these things were connected. It's very cosmic if you think about it. Yeah. So he brought his point of view to everything he did, whether it was buildings or... The thing that I heard him talk about, and I'm going to see if there's any links yet that I need to throw in here for you guys. We've talked about a lot so far, but really we've only covered early life.
Just his early life, just getting, an idea of who he was and where he came from. But he talks in this one interview, and I have part 2 of this interview pulled up. There's a part 1, and I was struggling to find it again, where he talks about when he was in these protests in college, protesting the Nazis and the fascists. He would be in these crowds of students and protesters, and they would be chanting things, and he would be hearing that as a rhythm that was predictable. And then he would say after a while you would start to hear the chaos because people would get out of rhythm and people would start shouting other things, and other rhythms would start happening, and then maybe there was gunfire. And all of these sounds together, if you listen to them as a whole, created a different sort of what he was calling randomness, like timbre. So when I was hearing him talk about that, it felt like the way he was talking about it was very influential in his then, when he went on to study music and composition, that these things that he experienced left such a mark on him. And of course they would. What he went through was extremely traumatic and intense, and life and death.
You can't get away with that not affecting.
And it drove him to see the world as a place that he wanted to make art and make more beautiful. And man, just what that forges in a person to overcome those things and survive.
It seems to me too that the one thing that a lot of these folks have in common, Pierre Schaeffer, for example, you can't really teach that level of being in tune to your environment, whatever that's called, as a overall
The
characteristic?
the worlds that they grew up in forced them or gave them an opportunity to hear things that hadn't been heard before.
Sensitive to your environment. And maybe that has a little bit to do with coming up in a time of war. Like you were literally
it's
worried
the most common thing that we have with everyone.
About, having to flee a place that you're in. Maybe you're just eating or, having a conversation with friends, and all of a sudden it becomes a literal war zone.
So your senses are already so heightened. That makes
right.
sense.
And I have a feeling that there's some, something to that in terms of, a lot of these electronic music pioneers, like you had to be so in tune. And they basically took that and allowed it to inform their artistic decisions later in life.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with, if you're in tune and you're hearing things that sound like music and rhythm and timbre that isn't in the traditional, what was mostly classical music at the time, and most of these people were studying classical music, you're going to bring something new to it because you have those experiences and that viewpoint. You can't really separate that.
Right. I mean, it might be a good segue to talk about who he ended up studying with later in his career, but that person also, instilled that same set of values in Stockhausen. Yeah.
So when he fled to Paris, that's really where he stayed for most of his adult life and where he did most of his work. He was able, again, one of these like Forrest Gump things, he was able to get work as an architect with the top leading architect of the time in Paris. How is that real? I don't know what he was doing. I said
the time when you could kind of like just elbow your way in. I'm really good at math. Okay,
He must have been. He started as like a pretty low-level person.
And he might have just worked his way up because people realized he was brilliant.
He had a lot to share, and so he was able to prove himself. But his most famous work is the Philips Pavilion at Expo 58, which was in Brussels. And this is probably one of the coolest buildings I have seen.
Expo 58.
Expo 58. So
super cool event. I believe that he designed it because there was a piece of music that was going to be performed in it.
Oh, yeah. So he actually, and I read this somewhere, but I'll have to confirm that most of the buildings that he designed were specifically for music to be experienced in them.
He was a big believer in an environment and the piece of music that was to be played to be sort of connected and one and the same.
So he wrote what I believe is his first electroacoustic music concrete piece that was played as you entered and exited the Philips Pavilion. But it was really built for Edgar Brézy's Poème Electronique to be played. So once you entered the building, that's what you experienced. And obviously, all the ties to Pierre Schaeffer, because they were all working in his studio and collaborating and using the equipment and studying with him. Although I did hear that Pierre Schaeffer was hardly ever around. Because he was always having to, go to the board meetings and, fundraise and, prove why they were, allowed to exist. And
he was fighting for the actual, keeping it alive, as an institution rather than making tape pieces at that point.
Yeah, so simultaneously, he is an architect with Le Corbusier. That was this person's name, this architect. Maybe you've heard of him. And he's studying with Olivier Messiaen, who also taught Stockhausen and others. But when I listen to Xenakis' music and I listen to Stockhausen, I hear so much of these similar...
Yeah. A lot of similarities.
Energy, I would say. Xenakis has a much more harsh, kind of tense to his music, whereas Stockhausen sometimes can get more, musical, and I can have it on in the background a little more. Depends on what the piece is.
Right.
But with Xenakis' music, like much of Pierre Schaeffer's, it's very like mechanical sounds, and you can't really do anything else.
It calls your attention.
There's no reading a book while listening to Xenakis' music. Maybe you could go on a walk. But really, it grabs every sense that you have in your body.
That's really interesting to me, like whatever it is that, is the difference there between like being able to do something while something else is on versus it completely captivating you and your attention, like what's
I'm not
in there?
A brain scientist, but my personal experience with certain types of ambient music is that I feel like it speaks to the back of my mind and sort of like maybe a subconscious layer of my mind, where I can have it on and it's like I'm listening, but I'm listening with a different part of myself.
Right.
And even, I would say, like pop and rock music, I can kind of go in and out of listening to it because there's familiar structures and rhythms that like maybe a different part of me is experiencing. And then I might come in and like, hear a certain horn part or an interesting electronic sound or a melody that I grab onto and I want to pay attention to, and then I can kind of go back. But with musique concrète, with specifically Xenakis' music, it is the front of your mind. It is your present self. It is your body. You are experiencing it. And if you turn any of that off and try to do something else, you really don't hear it in the same way. That's just my street brain science, take on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, and I agree, that seems to take place with, and that defines, I would say, ambient music is that,
It's supposed to be like a piece of furniture in the room.
Yeah, it does not specifically call your attention. It's ambiance. It blends in with whatever, environment you're listening to it in.
It can enhance your experience of the environment you're in.
Yeah. But I wonder if context has anything to do with that. Like, but like you're saying, it's almost like, you're listening to Xenakis and it pulls your attention. It kind of forces you to stop doing what you're doing and listen in.
It wants you to stand in the middle of the Phillips Pavilion and just listen.
Right.
Nothing else.
Versus, another piece comes on, ambient genre, different artist, all of a sudden, you get back into what you're doing. Like, that's the thing that I'm interested in, is like, what is the hidden, what's the secret sauce there?
I think it has to do with the level of randomness in his music. There's not repetition. This is similar to Stockhausen talked about this. He thought most popular music had too much repetition. So your brain can't really get into a rhythm. Like most ambient music is like a loop of something over and over and over again, maybe a slight variation, right? It's a soothing experience. But it could be every millisecond it's changing. There's no set rhythm. There's nothing to groove to. So you're kind of like in this state of like shock, kind of experiencing it. And also the types of timbres.
Yeah.
They're grating, they're harsh,
right.
They're mechanical.
He seemed to be much more drawn to like metallic sounds. Maybe it's a good time to talk a little bit about how he's considered the grandfather of granular synthesis.
Yeah, I mean, that's his legacy, and that's what he worked the rest of his life on. We're kind of jumping to that, which is totally fine, because that's really the meat and potatoes of what he was working towards. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, just that, granular synthesis is, the idea of taking a sound, that exists in the wild, so to speak, and maybe recording it and then chopping it up into very small milliseconds long pieces, and then changing the playback speed, which then affects the density of the micro sounds, if you will. And Xenakis is, documented as sort of being the godfather of this concept. And what's interesting is that he used sound generators and tape splicing to kind of create this effect. But it's something that is really popular now, and has become more popularized with the advent of computers and digital signal processing, and being able to, have a device, that's coded to do this process for you automatically. And I think it's hit a point of saturation almost at this point.
In certain circles.
In the sound, experimentation world.
Definitely not in the mainstream.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But it will.
Yeah, I could see it.
It will be applied to other disciplines, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. It already is percolating that way, but in a mainstream way, it's going to hit a tipping point.
But I guess my point is that I wonder if the granularity of the sound that he was experimenting with, I wonder if that has anything to do with the attention thing.
What about the attention thing?
Like it grabbing, a piece.
Oh, absolutely. That there's such a granular level of change going on.
That it forces your brain is saying, like, this is something to be alarmed of.
And you can't really hear the individual sounds. You can hear it as an overarching new sound as you hear everything together.
And so maybe the lack of familiarity,
your brain doesn't have anything to grab onto to become familiar
is causing you to pay attention to it. Like you're almost like constantly trying to figure out, is this something that's going to hurt me? Or
I have a feeling I can play this and won't get in trouble for it because it's so obscure, but just an example of granular synthesis.
Ooh.
So that was fast and slow granular synthesis. But I do find it interesting that he was doing this, he was playing with this as a concept because he was applying his, mathematical equations about probability and using tape machines and equipment to simulate almost an idea that wouldn't be possible until the computing power was where it is today.
I think because of the fact, like when we researched him, we were trying to find, where's the tape involved, like how
we knew he worked with Pierre Schaeffer, so he made some music concrete pieces.
And you can find it here and there, but it's definitely not the focal point. That leads me to believe that he wasn't all that enthused to be working with tape necessarily. Like he did it because that was what existed at the time to accomplish his goal, which is in my mind two specific schools of tape musician. There's those that embraced it spoke to them, they enjoyed it, they like, there was something about the oxide that really like, gelled with them as a person. And then there's those that like used it, for example, Pauline Oliveros.
Yeah,
she used it because she had to, but that wasn't it for her, or necessarily like, she didn't continue. She did
get excited about computers and the capabilities there, whereas some people rejected computerized anything. So there's definitely like two schools there. Éliane
Radigue.
Yes.
Continued to use tape.
Still using her ARP and tape.
And tape, because there was something to that's, that she gelled with as a person, versus.
So it's like a personality thing.
Yeah. And then, even, what's her name? I'm drawing a blank right now. Radiophonic Workshop founder Daphne Oram. Yeah, even Daphne Oram embraced, the idea of the computer.
Yeah, that's
career.
right. She converted her Aramics idea into something for the computer, but wasn't able to fully see that through.
So I would say that it's actually a lot more rare to find someone that
doesn't go towards that.
That continued, to use tape as their main bread and butter, even past the time of things being possible in digital sound processing. Yeah,
and I think it probably had a lot to do with, where are they in the world? What do they have access to? What are they exposed to? What's their life journey? All of those factors.
So with that, my point is going to be that I think we're in a special time now that I feel like people are really starting to embrace the tape medium for all of these characteristics. Like, I get asked all the time, like, why would you use tape? And the reason is because, or why would you use it when it's not practical? It doesn't make sense. There's no real reason. It doesn't provide any convenience.
Right.
Compared to other methods that are available for recording and sound processing and things. And my answer always has to do with why it has this unique property to it. It has like sort of this magical
and it's an and
essence, and it's sort of an and
part of our studio. It's not
part
the
of it.
only
It's not
thing
the only
we
thing
can
we
use.
Right?
We can bridge some things with.
So my point is that we're in a sort of a special time that people are choosing to embrace it, even though it's not convenient for its special properties.
Well, there's something about the tactileness, and also I think because we look at screens all day, we're in our computers all day.
Right. There's this
it's
intrigue.
something to get away from all of that, and to use our hands and to have a more mechanical experience with something.
And some of the things that may have been considered a detractor, back in the day, like the noise, signal to noise ratio, and the fact that every time you play a tape, you're basically losing a little bit. Yeah, you're degrading the recording. We've sort of flipped that, completely on its back and decided, hey, that's actually what we really like about tape. Like those same principles and properties are the main reason why we use tape. I would say those are the things that I like about it.
I would say though, at the height of tape music, they were in commercial settings, they were in universities, they were in places where there was a demand, there was a deadline. They obviously didn't have a lot of the conveniences of other aspects that we have now. So I think people who got really frustrated with it were those who were being pushed to create something for a certain purpose within a certain deadline at a certain level of quality that maybe they couldn't get, or they couldn't get within the time frame. So, especially if you're working with, so that's one side of it, but if you're also just innovating and you're working with an idea that you have, the process is so slow and kind of risky, right? Like one false move and you've lost all the work that you did.
Right.
So, because we can back things up, we can, digitize stuff, it's not as risky.
Right.
So I think that's part of it too, is the setting they were working in.
That I think that has a lot to do also with why analog synthesis kind of went out of style, because of the convenience of the computer and MIDI and everything.
In like the 80s, 90s?
Yeah, like the industry was, sort of being forced to embrace the digital technologies for convenience sake, and all of a sudden, like you could buy a mini Moog for, like $100.
Yeah, so crazy. The waves of things coming in and out of style.
And now we're full circle. I see people using, like Atari computers from the 90s.
Yes, you're on a 1/4-inch ledge all the time. I love that.
What's up, Kyle?
We like to live on the edge.
I see people using like Atari Falcon ST computers from like the mid 80s, to do MIDI sequencing because it's just the sequencer and the MIDI port was built into the computer. And it's like, well, why would you do that? It's because it's fun, it's interesting, it's basic. You don't have all these other distractions. You're not going to get IM'd on the same computer that you're using to sequence a song with. So there's this desire for things to be more simple. Mm-hmm. And so I find that really interesting.
Yeah. So he was
back to Xenakis.
Yeah, back to Xenakis. We like to go off on these tangents and then come back to things, but the thing that really grabbed me, that I love the most about what he did, was this thing called the U-Pick. Oh man, it's so good. So I have this YouTube mini documentary of him talking about it, and talk about computers, talk about retro computers that were cutting edge at the time.
It seems like one of those things that would still be cutting edge, though. Like
I want one.
Right.
I know I don't even know if they exist anymore, and when they did, they were only in like museums, or like they would have one in like a cultural space where people could come and play with it.
And I'm glad we mentioned Daphne Oram, because one of the first things that I thought about when I saw this thing was like, it's the Oramix device taken to the next level.
Yeah, he was able to take it to the next level. He lived till 2001. I think he was still working until like 1997. So he was able to live kind of and work in that moment where we were getting some more access. But it's really, really funny. The setup that he had, it's like, I gotta find this image of what the layout of it. It's like 3 computers and a separate monitor. And
right.
Like the
little diagram.
The thing that you draw on is like
and a magnetophone, which is a reel-to-reel recorder.
Yeah, like it's insane. So it's this thing that you draw the waveforms and like kind of what you want their character to be over time. And then I think that it gets translated somehow to one of the computers. There's a couple different processes involved, and then that spits out the sound. So it's like an advanced Oramix machine, because she was drawing on film and then the machine was creating the sound from the graphic score.
Right. It seems like a very similar process, just digital. But
it's like
you're drawing
so
on this.
Overwrought with how many components are involved to make it happen. But it's a really cool, I think, like front end user experience.
Yeah, it looked like
you're just like drawing on a giant pad of paper. Like children are doing it. Like you don't need to know anything about music. And that was his whole vibe. Was he wanted because he didn't formally study music, and the music world, eventually considered him one of the great composers, but he was very rejected because he wasn't a traditional composer, and at the time everyone was doing those graphic scores and he was writing things more traditionally. So I found that really interesting that he ended up inventing something for graphic score.
Yeah. I mean,
I gotta find this.
There were a lot of people that were, composing music at around the same time he was, that were completely rejecting everything that he was doing. They called him, they made fun of him, really. Like, he had a hard time, did we kind of brush on the fact that he had a hard time having somebody take him on?
Oh, no, we didn't.
As a student.
He studied with Olivier Messiaen, but
took a while to get there.
He tried to study with 4 or 5 other people, and they were like, you're too old.
And you don't know anything.
You don't know anything about music, and you're too old to start. You're too old to be a beginner.
We would have to do music theory foundations with you, and we're not going to do that.
Yeah, he should have been studying harmony and things like that. And he, when Olivier Messiaen took him on, I think it was kind of informal, because he told him to just embrace the things that he already knew about math and his Greek culture, and to just do whatever he wanted.
Which is very similar
to his unique self.
Advice that he gave Stockhausen, his other student.
Do only what is completely unique to you and your experience and who you are and how you view the world, and then make that. Okay, I found this screenshot of, which I can't share, but I'll try to share it later.
You found it.
Of the layout of the U-Pick, and it's like this main terminal, and then that goes into some sort of processor, and then that goes out to 2 different computers.
It looks very similar to an 80s MIDI setup.
And also to a tape machine. And then also out to a visual component. So it like basically takes what you draw and puts it into a computer that then
Translates
is the
it.
visual as well on the computer, but then it also goes to a tape machine that then produces the sound, and there's a microphone. It is hilarious, this drawing. It's amazing. So I love this because, you know, there's quite a few clips on YouTube of him talking about it and people playing with it, and it's just bizarre. And the sound it makes, of course, you'd be like, well, that's not music.
Right.
Why are we even bothering with this? But it was all part of his journey to develop algorithmic music and granular synthesis and randomness. He was really, really interested in randomness in music.
Yeah, and earlier when we were discovering this about him, I mentioned that, you know, the random module is always, you know, like kind of a very tasteful module and like a modular synthesizer setup. And there's different sort of colors of randomness, you know, much like there are filters and oscillators. And I just, you know, I have a feeling that the people who designed these modules, you know, must have studied, you know, Xenakis's work, you know, because like it's like he's sort of like the big name in randomness, you know, when you kind of go down this
Yes.
this path of learning about, you know, who used it in their compositional style. Stockhausen was another one, you know, they were similar in that regard. There were a lot of similarities between Xenakis and Stockhausen, I'm realizing now.
A lot,
and so
yeah.
it makes sense that they had the same mentor.
Yeah, Xenakis became a professor.
Similar to Terry Riley and Pauline Oliveros and a few other ones. What's his name? Rush. And what was the name of their teacher? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, I can't remember it now. This is what happens to me. I absorb
Too
things.
much information.
I absorb
too
like a
fast.
sponge, and I can tell you like, you know, an hour-long story that's like verbatim, and then 3 weeks later, I'll be like, "Have we met?"
Right. But they had a lot of similar theories and ways of creating.
Yeah. So having a mentor, those people don't get as much, you know, credit or maybe, you know, clout, fame, and stuff for.
Well, we're
being
not talking
the
about
teachers.
them on
Yeah, no.
Cosmic Conversation.
They weren't the you know, the artists out there on the front lines. But they're the most important, you know, like we wouldn't have all these people without their influence.
Maybe we should do a show that is sort of dedicated to
An episode just for the teachers and the mentors.
the mentors of.
That's a good idea. But they weren't really using tape music, any of these people.
That's a good point.
Composition instructors, but somehow the people they were teaching were experimenting with
Yeah.
the tape.
They weren't like
The tape.
go chop a tape sound up into a million
No,
little
that's
pieces.
what I remember when we were doing our Daphne Oram conversation. I was like, who taught her tape music? No one.
Well, as we've learned by, you know, studying many philosophers, it's all about discovery, right? Like,
Yeah, she was just like, I'm going to play around with this stuff. Pierre Schaeffer was the same way. There was nobody that was like, oh, you must go to this mentor and teacher and learn about tape music.
curiosity leads to discovering and being true to who you are. Apparently, it's really good advice. You know, I think these things combined lead to
Yeah.
being a good artist.
Yeah, all of the people so far that we studied have been very individual, very much like kind of like loners, maybe not as appreciated during their time, you know, that sort of thing, where
Right.
they weren't going with the grain. Xenakis certainly wasn't. He was like,
They weren't just filming themselves playing, you know, like, you know, composers, Beethoven, Bach, you
Yeah.
know, like.
and we need that too, but this is just what we happen to be interested in right now. There's something that also jumped out at me that I want to research more this week with your help. Something where it said he designed a cosmic city. And the link that I found goes to a 404. So I have to look into this more.
Of course it does.
Because it's so cosmic it doesn't exist.
I know, we were like, Cosmic City.
I think, we're also pretty enthusiastic about architecture and design, and I think that goes along with like spaces where music happens and ambiance and all that kind of stuff. So for me, it's going to be really fun this week to live in the brain of Xenakis, because it's the way that he saw the world and created physical structures as well as the music. And if there's a cosmic city out there, I have to find it.
Definitely.
So that's what I'm excited about.
I was shocked when I found out that he built he designed, it said by himself, the Phillips Pavilion at Expo 58.
Yeah, he used a specific sort of mathematical process to build this crazy looking structure that is it's like nothing I've ever seen. So he's a really singular figure.
It's what I want my dream house to look like.
Yeah.
I'm realizing at this point.
A little bit sharp. A lot of sharp edges.
Yeah.
But one other thing I wanted to share was one of his most important pieces, or his first pivotal piece, was Metastasis. And so if you're going to listen to one thing this week of his, it's probably this.
Which he was taking the advice of his mentor in naming all of his pieces.
They all have Greek names.
Greek names, yeah. So that was like his way of...
I think this is an English version of spelling it, though, this link that I just did. But yes, so he really embraced his Greek heritage, and that all of that spoke to his music. And there's like a lot of other stuff we didn't touch on, so we'll probably do a lot more in the group this week talking about all these different concepts, because he did a lot of music for orchestras, which, again, that's not tape music, but the way that he did it really fed into his furtherance of electronic music. So I want to talk about that stuff more, but I think we're getting close to running out of time here.
Yeah, it might be worth mentioning that despite the fact that his composing style was very unorthodox as opposed to like traditional composers, he still made it a point to notate his work in a standard notation. And so that's kind of one thing that sets him apart from some of these other experimental composers.
I still imagine that it's very, very hard to read and play his music, but people are doing it. So that could be a fun thing that we cover this week as well. Is
we'll watch Jacqueline try to play one of his pieces on piano? Yeah, watch me
try to play one of his pieces. No, what I meant is there's plenty of stuff out there, YouTube videos and such, of people playing his music now, and I'd be really interested to see more of that. Yeah, so super excited to have a group research on Iannis Xenakis this week, and hopefully by the end of the week I'll be able to say his name 20 times fast.
I think the first tape composer release by the Limelight label, which I've posted about on the group that I love,
we'll do some Limelight.
Had a Xenakis piece in it, so that was one of my first, times being exposed to his work was through that label, Limelight. Mm-hmm. They're doing great started stuff. Out as a traditional jazz label.
That's right. Ruth White was put out on Limelight?
Yeah, Ruth White was one of their releases, but then they sort of like, in the late 60s, they transitioned to more experimental tape music, and a lot of good releases out on Limelight.
You'd think we were getting an endorsement by them, but we are not.
Well,
we just like them all.
They're long since defunct, I would say.
Yeah, so. I'm just saying. Thank you guys for joining us today. It's been a while since we've covered a specific person in our Cosmic Conversations, and I'm excited to be back on track. And if you're excited, as we are, to talk about Iannis Xenakis this week, I know I am. So if you've heard of him before, or if this is all new to you, we'd love to know where you're at on the spectrum.
Yeah, post all of your Yanni stories.
He likes to call him Yanni because it's so similar. He thinks it's funny. But I'm still trying to get my mouth to say Iannis Xenakis. I'm going to be working on that.
It's a little bit of a tongue twister.
I'm working on that for
I haven't attempted it. I don't think I'm going to.
That's why you keep calling him Yanni.
Yeah.
I wonder if he had a nickname. yeah, we'll definitely be talking more in the group this week about Giannis, or Yanni if you want to call him Yanni. I don't know if he would mind since he's not around to complain. But yeah, have a great week, and we'll look forward to talking to you more in the group.
Ta-ta.